All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on how to get started as a test automation engineer. We're really excited to have you all, and most importantly, to have Angie Jones with us today to give this presentation. Angie is a Java champion and a senior director who specializes in test automation strategies and techniques. And we're really excited to see what she has to share today. Before we get into that, just one quick note: this webinar is being recorded. So if you want to go through and watch back again, you can, a link will be sent to the email that you registered for this webinar with. Also, we are streaming to YouTube and Twitter as well, so you can go and rewatch that broadcast immediately after. Again, as I said, Angie is a Java champion and a senior director. Her specialty is in test automation, strategies and techniques. So we really have the expert here to talk about this. Angie is also a master inventor and is known for her innovative and out-of-the-box thinking style. And she has more than 25 patented inventions to her name in the US and China, which is incredible. On top of that, Angie is also actively engaged in speaking at software conferences all over the world, writing tutorials and technical articles on angiejones.tech, and in leading the online learning platform Test Automation University. And also on top of that, Angie volunteers with Black Girls Code, where she teaches coding workshops to young girls in an effort to attract more women and minorities into tech. And so, Angie, I know that just with that, you have a very full schedule. So I'm really grateful you were able to take some time with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Seth. Hello, everyone. It's Angie here. As you've heard, I'm a principal automation architect, also developer advocate. And in this role, I've had the pleasure of training thousands of engineers around the world. And many people are intrigued by the career path of a test automation engineer. Or sometimes they're pushed in this direction by leadership. And they aren't always sure of where to begin. So, in this talk, I'll cover what exactly is a test automation engineer. I'll cover the various skills that you need to become one. And also, when you're ready for that job, how do you stand out when seeking it? So, what exactly is a test automation engineer? Well, it's a hybrid role that requires both development and also testing skills. So I like to think of automation engineers as folks who have a developer skill set and a tester's mindset. Not only are both of these skills needed, but a test automation engineer needs to be pretty solid at both, which is what makes this really challenging to find people for this type of role, because usually a software engineer is really strong in one of these disciplines but not necessarily both. So we have quite a hard time finding people, which makes this a really good career choice because there's plenty of open roles and not enough qualified folks to fill them. So what exactly does one do in this role? Test automation engineers, they write programs that automate regression tests to provide the development team, which they're a part of, with fast feedback on the quality of the application. Let's look at an example request for a feature. So you're working on a brand new e-commerce website, and there's a feature request that says, as a customer, I should be able to add products to my cart. Now, given this feature, your team may come up with several ideas on how to test this, right? Maybe adding a product to the cart, a single product, or maybe increasing the quantity before adding it to the cart. Selecting options such as size and color, and then adding to the cart, or adding a product that already exists to the cart, and so on, right? While you should definitely test these scenarios manually, it's also a great idea to automate the tests so that As the application evolves and more features are added and refactored, you can quickly run any valuable test to ensure nothing is broken. I hope that at this point you're thinking, wow, that sounds great, Angie, sign me up. If so, stay tuned because to become an automation engineer, I want to share 3 steps with you. The very first step is you're going to need to learn how to code. If you already know how to code, great, wonderful, you're in excellent shape. If you don't worry, you can pick it up, but it's definitely a major part of the role, so you cannot skip this part. All right. Many of the people who go into this role are software testers, and they make the mistake of trying to write tests without necessarily knowing how to code. So they jump right into learning about, some of the automation tools such as Selenium WebDriver or Cypress, but they struggle to use them because they haven't yet learned how to write clean and efficient code. Now, I'm not going to lie to you and say that learning to code is easy. It's not, but it is doable if you're truly committed. Here's a couple of ways you can go about this. So, the first option is the do it yourself approach, right? This is where you're kind of self learning. You can do this by taking some self guided online courses or, reading programming books. The pros of using the do it yourself option is you get to learn at your own pace. We're all busy, right? You may already be working a full time job, doing something else. You may have a family at home, and then you have your personal time. I get it. So it's really good to have the leeway to do what you can when you can. And this option is a lot more flexible and it works well for those who lead busy lives like myself. The other pro is that you get to curate your own learning path. So when I studied computer science in college, I had to take a bunch of courses that, quite frankly, I've never used in my career. So you won't have that problem with this option. You have the freedom to tailor your curriculum to exactly what you need. And that's pretty nice. Now, of course, it's not all, unicorns and rainbows. There's some cons with this approach as well. One is that you don't have a personal instructor who's going to hold you accountable, right? What this means is you're going to have to show some discipline and make sure, you're completing your courses, you're taking your quizzes, you're doing any exercises that the online instructor has left for you. Sometimes you need to do some additional research and learning, so that you cover a bit more than what was given in the course. And so you need to be up for that challenge. Another con is that you'll need to find the time to do this. So we've already talked about your busy schedule, and you'll need to really think about how you'll be able to squeeze in some, intense studying into your schedule. And as with the many things in tech, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. So it's not like riding a bike, unfortunately. No, you have to continuously practice at technical skills. And learning what to study is also very important because there's not just one course that you can take, which will give you all that you need to become an automation engineer. There's several courses, in fact, and I'll touch on those topics in a bit. Okay, so the second option is to obtain formal training. So, one way to gain this is to go back to school. However, there's no college programs that I know of that offer an entire degree in test automation. However, in the United States, some of our colleges and universities, they offer one-off continuing education courses that you can take to obtain the certain skill you're after, such as computer programming, for example. Another approach could be to request formal in house training at your job. So, this is a great option if there's a team of you who all need to learn how to become automation engineers. And there are several consultants available to come and maybe do hands on workshops to train the team. Now, some of the pros of this option is you have this dedicated time to learn. You don't have to figure out when you're going to find time to do this. It's already scheduled and you need to commit to that schedule. Another benefit is that you can likely get this kind of thing covered under training budget. So your current employer is likely to pay for formal training, and this is true of online courses as well. So don't sleep on this option. I find a lot of times people don't even realize they have training budgets or they don't ask to use them. Usually this stuff is budgeted in, is set aside for you. So if you ask, it shouldn't be a problem. Another pro is one thing that differs with this approach is you're going to get a breadth of coverage. So this may give you like a broader perspective and also touch on some of the other areas you'll need to go deeper into later. Okay. Now, one con is that you'll need to convince management to allow you to do this formal training approach, right? Not only are you asking for money, you're also asking for that dedicated time to take the trainings. And unfortunately, managers may not always be able to grant you both of these things. Another drawback is that you may get more than you really need. So I kind of listed this as a pro, but it's kind of a con too. Let's say, for example, that you opt to take a Java course in person, right? If it's at a college or your employer has hired a pricey consultant to teach you, they're going to cover a lot about the language, probably much, much more than you need to become an automation engineer. Now, while it's good to go deep into a language, let's face it, it can also be quite overwhelming. So, what exactly do I need to learn besides programming, Angie? I mentioned earlier that there's a lot to learn. So, I want to go over some recommended learning paths, right? So, let's first start with the programming language. So, there's many of these programming languages out there. If you're just getting started, you might kind of be stumped. Which one of these should I pick? That answer depends. I wish I could give you a hard answer, but I'll give you some considerations, okay? If you're already employed and you're going to become an automation engineer on a specific team, then you should consider learning the programming language that team is using. Okay. There's certainly some benefits to this. You have resident experts at your disposal just in case you run into questions or issues. Also, if you use the same language as the development team, it's easier to add tests directly to the development project. And with this, your developers will be hopefully more likely to add tests themselves and to also help you to maintain them. The only time that this is really a con is if the development team is using some obscure programming language, which doesn't have a good ecosystem of testing tools readily available. Then you should probably consider something else. Now, let me point out that you're not required to automate tests using the same programming language that the app is built in. For example, if your team is using JavaScript to build the front end of the application, you can still write the automated tests in any language of your choice. So don't feel like you're boxed in. Okay. In fact, if you're going to invest a bunch of time in learning how to code, you want it to be with a language that's marketable. If your team is using an outdated or a less popular programming language, that might not be of much help to you when you go to seek your next job. Now, I've seen a lot of candidates who they start learning how to code in a particular language. They try to start an automation project at their job. The team is not invested. So they want to move to a company that takes automation more seriously. However, they have a difficult time because they not only lack a lot of experience in test automation, but they also don't have a comparable language under their belt. Okay. So here are some of the most popular ones that I've seen in job recs for the US. And note that this can vary for different countries, but it should be pretty similar. Okay. Java was by far the most popular language sought after for test automation roles. And this isn't entirely surprising to me because the types of companies that typically have dedicated automation engineers on staff are usually enterprise companies, and many of them are Java shops. The next most sought after programming language for test automation roles is Python, which many argue is one of the easier languages to pick up. So if you want to start with Python as your programming language of choice, that is not a bad decision. Third was JavaScript, which is certainly on the rise. And I anticipate this to eventually surpass Python, probably in the near future for test automation roles, because I'm seeing several new JavaScript testing tools that have hit the market that have people very excited in recent years. And that's really helping to drive this number up. And then the fourth most sought after programming language for test automation is C sharp, followed by Ruby, which was the least sought after. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some context and something to think about when choosing which programming language you should start to learn. Now, after you learn to program, I strongly recommend an intro like web development course, and this will help you understand how apps are built. So you want to look for one that covers HTML and the DOM, which stands for Document Object Model. You want to make sure that that course includes some CSS and pay special attention in that course to how you use CSS and XPath as selectors, because this is a must have skill for UI and mobile automation. Okay. Also, a course like this is going to provide you with, some client and server side knowledge, and they'll likely throw in some JavaScript as well, which is the language of the web. So that's definitely a good skill to have. Whether you decide to, pick up Java or Python instead of JavaScript as your main language, it's still nice to be able to dabble in JavaScript a little bit. Because even though I write like a lot of my test automation in Java, there's some things that maybe the tool or the library doesn't support or doesn't provide. And because JavaScript is the language of the web, I can simply insert a little bit of JavaScript to get what I need done. So definitely a skill to have. As far as like this type of course, I can't tell you how much knowing web development has helped me as a test automation engineer. When you truly understand how all of these pieces work together, you can come up with better ways to test it. Okay. You want to get some SQL on here too. So SQL, this may or may not be involved in your web development course. Hopefully you find one that has like this database component to it. But if not, then you want to take a course on SQL as well. So this is really helpful. It's not needed in all test automation roles, but it really is a nice skill to have. Most of my roles, I've had to use it even if it's just a little bit. It's not a primary skill that I'm using every day, but it's definitely something that I've used in each of my roles. Okay. All right. So you've learned how to code. Now what? Now you're ready to learn how to automate. But there's so many layers of an application, and there's different approaches to testing each one. For example, there's the UI, which is the interface that your customers they use this to engage with your product. So it definitely makes sense to test this out, right? And this is where your HTML and your selectors knowledge is going to come into play because you have to automate browser interactions and verify them. So if we were, to think about a scenario where somebody needed to, add something to a cart, you would literally automate those steps of, clicking the button and going to the cart and verifying the action is correct. Okay, so some of the most popular tools for automating UI tests are Selenium WebDriver, which is available in several programming languages such as Java, Python, JavaScript, C Sharp, and Ruby. And this is the most popular, and it is an open source tool, so definitely keep that one in mind. This is probably the most sought after if you're looking at job recs, so definitely one to consider. There's also Cypress, which is pretty popular. So Cypress is much newer compared to Selenium WebDriver, but it's old enough that it's gained quite a following and quite a community. So I think you can feel pretty safe in investing in this as a tool. This one is only for JavaScript, so only look into this one if you chose JavaScript as your programming language. For JavaScript, there's also WebDriver IO, which is really popular as well. Okay. Another promising newcomer to the tool space in test automation is Playwright, which is developed by Microsoft and also open source. This tool is available in multiple programming languages such as Java, JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, and .NET. So, also a good option to consider. Because you're testing the UI, the appearance of that is really important as well. And there are visual testing tools such as Apply tools, which will ensure that your app looks visually perfect. So, also want to consider. Another type of test automation is for mobile apps. Now, for this one, you may need to test iOS or Android apps, or sometimes even both of them. And if you need to test both and they have similar workflows, I recommend using an open source tool called Appium, which will allow you to write your iOS and your Android tests in the same code base. And Appium is also available in several programming languages. If you only need to test Android apps, then Espresso is a good choice. And this one is made by Google, also open source. Or if you only need to test iOS apps, then Apple's XCUI test tool is a good option. This one is not open source, but it is free to use. Okay. Just like with web, you're testing the front end of the app, so be sure to include your visual testing here as well. And Tools covers mobile too, so that's neat. Another layer is web services, or also known as APIs. So there are some automation engineers that specialize in API test automation, but I argue that even if your specialty is in web or mobile test automation, you should also know how to make API requests and verify their responses. So I use APIs all the time in my web and mobile tests to do setup, to tear down actions that are needed for tests, maybe even to verify that something kind of happens on the back end, and this greatly speeds the tests up as these run faster than UI and mobile automation does. Some of the tools in this space are Rest Assured, which is available for Java, and also Postman, which is available for JavaScript. And lastly, there's units, which are the individual methods or functions of your application, right? So this is getting down to the nitty gritty details. Most times, the developers are on the hook for writing their own unit tests. But as an automation engineer, you can provide a lot of guidance and value here. For example, you can suggest ideas for unit tests very early on before they even start writing the code. So this will help them, think about different edge cases and scenarios. You can participate in code reviews. So when someone is submitting a feature, I go right to the test so I can figure out like what's already been covered and are there any cases that are of value that are missing. And you can even add more unit tests as you think of them. So sometimes I do all of that. I suggest them, I review them, everything looks good. I might have a few suggestions. But then later on, as I'm, developing maybe UI tests, I think, this might be better suited at the unit level. And instead of bugging that developer, I go ahead and add a few more myself. Okay. Now, it's rare for automation engineers to be experts in all of these different lanes. So, to find someone who's expert in UI, mobile, web services, and unit is not very realistic. Usually, an automation engineer focuses on one of these lanes. So, don't become overwhelmed trying to master like each one of these. Touch on them, or maybe read a blog post or something like that, a little quick tutorial, but then pick one of these lanes to go deep on and master. Okay. There are also some complementary processes related to test automation that you should familiarize yourself with, such as BDD, which is behavior driven development, and also TDD, which is test driven development. So, behavior driven development is an example based methodology for developing software. The key to BDD is the collaborative exercises between essentially three parties: the business, so this would be someone like your product owner, a developer, the developer who needs to write this feature, and then the tester who's going to test this feature, right? So these parties are collectively known as the three amigos. Cute, right? Now, when beginning the work for a new feature, the three amigos they get together in like a meeting and they write examples. And these examples can be like scenarios essentially. And they write these in their natural language, specifying how this feature will be used, essentially the behavior of this feature, right? And by discussing these examples, all parties come to a shared understanding of how the feature should behave in these various scenarios. So everyone is clear up front before you start writing any code. So it's a nice quality initiative. Now, these examples can be used later as the spec that the tests are written against, which is helpful for a lot of teams. So, this is also nice to learn, and there's some tools available to help with this, such as Cucumber. Now, test driven development is also a complementary approach, which prescribes that you write the test before you write the feature code. And this is mostly done by developers since it has to be done before the feature development. Like it's kind of done all in one sitting. But it's something that you should at least be aware of, where that exists or a process that, a potential team may follow. Okay. So here are some of the tools that I discussed. Again, for UI, you have Selenium WebDriver, you have Cypress, you have Playwright. These are all good options. WebDriver IO for UI is also a good one. For mobile, you have your Appium, your Espresso, and your XCUI tests. Again, Appium can be used for both Android and iOS, whereas Espresso is Android specific and XUI test is iOS specific. For your web services, you have Rest Assured, which works in Java, and you have Postman that works in JavaScript. For BDD, you have a tool called Cucumber. For assertions, let's talk about assertions for a moment. So, when you're writing tests, all of those tools that I mentioned above, those tools, pretty much all of them are basically interaction tools or automation tools. So they'll help you automate the scenario, but they may not have validation tools built into them, right? Some of them will bundle something with it, like Cypress will bundle Mocha with it. But other times you have to add your own assertion library to your project. So if you want to just do, your traditional assertions for Java, you have JUnit and testing G. For JavaScript, you have Mocha, as well as Chai. You have Jest as well, made by Facebook. For Python, you have PyTest. Okay. And then for your visual assertions, where you're making sure the screen looks fine, you have Applitools. Okay, so after you've learned how to code your tests, you need to know how to execute them. And most mature teams are using continuous integration or continuous deployment, also known as CI/CD. They're using this to build their code. And as part of that build, automated tests run to make sure that there are no regressions before integrating or deploying the new code changes. So, this is definitely something that you want to learn about. Okay. You don't have to be a master here. This is one of those things you do better as you pick it up on the job, but you at least want to be familiar with the terminology and stuff so that, you can ask some educated questions. Also, you want to look into ways to run your tests in parallel. So, some of this will affect how you write your tests, essentially, like making sure your tests are independent and, they're not modifying the same data. And some of this will require learning about things like grids and containers, which will help you execute your tests in parallel to speed up execution time. Okay. Now, I mentioned that test automation engineers are good at both development and testing. So, you need to be sure you spend a considerate amount of time understanding how to test software, not just automate it. Okay. You need to be good at coming up with valuable scenarios. And I've said that word valuable a couple of times in this talk so far. And what I mean by that is you're not like going overboard and thinking of every single edge case you possibly can, and automating that, because it does take time to automate these tests. So you only want to automate, ones that are valuable, that are giving valuable feedback to the team, right? If it's something that no customer would ever do, or, they have to jump through hoops to do that edge case scenario, that might not be worth your time. Okay. So not only the scenarios, but you need to understand personas, because not everyone is going to use your app the same way, right? Different people have different goals for using your app. So you keep all of these personas in mind when trying to come up with scenarios. Make sure you're testing for all of your different customers. And you need to understand how to identify risky areas and focus your automation efforts there. Risk is a big thing. And you'll come to this concept lots of times in software development. You're going to want to do everything. You're not going to have enough time to do so. So you have to start looking at what risks are presented here and how do I mitigate those most effectively, right? And you should also know how to structure tests. So, a common model is the arrange, act, assert model, where within your automated test, you first put your application in a desired state. That's the arrange. And then your automated test is going to take some action. Essentially, this is the scenario, right? And then you're going to do an assertion. So, knowing what to assert is extremely important, as this is the difference between a good and a bad test. So, it's definitely imperative that you take some time to really think about how you do that sort of thing, okay? And what assertion should you make, right? You don't want to just have one simple assertion, but think about what would you really be asserting if you did this manually. And sometimes some of those assertions are subconscious things, for example, so you definitely want to keep that in mind when you're automating it, because the computer is only going to check exactly what you told it to check, and not necessarily all of those gotchas that you would have noticed as a human being. All right. Now, everything I suggested so far has been very technical and involved some usage of tools, but it's very, very important to also learn about strategy. You see, test automation projects, they often fail. And you need to know this up front before you get in this game. And this is often because people jump headfirst into learning how to do it and not spending enough attention on why they're doing it. So their actions don't support the business goal, right? So you want to focus on things like how to develop a test automation strategy that's going to meet your business needs. You want to look at how do I cultivate a culture within the org, that's conducive to the success of an automation initiative. Because if everyone is not on board with, the testing initiatives, then you kind of see like the project get abandoned, or as the tests are failing as part of CI/CD, people are more annoyed than anything. They may not trust them, they may not look into them and maintain them. So you definitely need to make sure everybody's on the same page before you start this initiative, because believe it or not, a test automation initiative is essentially a software development project. So you're really running like your main software development project as well as the test automation one. You want to look at some techniques that your developers can employ to support the test automation initiative, and make the app more testable. So every app is not the most testable thing ever. So, you want to learn some techniques such as, if you're doing UI or mobile, make sure you have some unique identifiers on the elements. You want to make sure there's some APIs available that maybe you can call into to do your setup and your tear down. If you need to have SQL read access to be able to query things to move your tests faster, things like that. Also, you want to know how to choose the right tools for your initiative. So I gave you a little bit of insight on how to consider that, like what is the team using, what's the ecosystem around this language. Is there support for this particular library? Is it brand new and we don't know if it's going to be maintained forever? Like all of those are things to consider. Also, there should be some early considerations on how to better prepare you for the future of your test automation project. So, maintenance is a nightmare with test automation projects. It's essentially written whenever you write your test, you're writing your test to target the current, state of the application. But as the application evolves, as more features are added, as they're refactored, as features are removed from the product, the tests need to be updated as well. So you have to give some consideration to the time it's going to take to do this, as well as who's going to do it, right? Who's on the hook for this? And we all know when something is everyone's responsibility, ends up being no one's responsibility. Also look into how to optimize, how to scale your automation project, right? So when you first start out, you're going to be adding a couple of tests, but it may get to the point where you get to hundreds, where you get to thousands. You need to run this as part of some CI/CD pipeline, and your test can't take an hour or two to run. So looking at how do you optimize, how do you scale? Also, how do you quantify the return on your investment? because people are going to ask about this. Leadership is going to ask because it takes a significant amount of time and resources and people to be able to pull this off. So you want to know, how am I going to know when I'm successful, and how do I share the value of the test automation with my organization? So, step one was to learn how to code. Step two was to learn about automation. And step three is to continue to learn. So, this is an ongoing process. Things are always changing in tech, and there is just so much to learn, even with just this one role. So, you're never going to get to a finished state. I've been doing this for almost 20 years, and I still have a lot to learn. There's always something new that I'm looking to learn. So, how do you continue learning? There's lots of different options, and I do pretty much all of these. So, taking courses, again, whether that be online courses here, or whether that's a course that you're taking in person, you definitely want to keep your skills up to date with some courses. Don't be afraid to read some technical books. So, and that can be on anything. It doesn't have to be just test automation, but, software development processes and all of those things that'll help you see the bigger picture. I love reading blogs and articles, so you can subscribe to, some RSS feeds, or, someone's newsletter whose blog you really like. And, there's all kinds of blogs and articles, several of them posted on a daily basis around test automation. One that I like is called the Ministry of Testing. So if you go to that website, they do have a blog section that you can subscribe to. And so that's where I get all my good news from. And they are essentially synced up to lots of different practitioners' blogs. So every time somebody posts something new, it'll show up in that feed. I also watch webinars like this one here. So you're already on the right track if you've gotten to this point. People do webinars all the time. There's no shortage of webinars on test automation. Some of these topics will, be technical deep dives. Some of them may be more, academic in nature, or some of them talk about different process and strategies. All of that is good stuff. So definitely, keep your ear to the street there. Podcasts are also good. My favorite one on testing is called Test Talks. And it's on all of the, places where you go to listen to podcasts. But what I like about that podcast is that Joe Colantonio is the host, and he's always interviewing someone who, is doing something new or unique. And it's really good to hear like the other problems people are solving. Sometimes it's not always relative to my current job in that very moment. But I kid you not, it might be, 6 months, it could be 2 years from now. And I'm going to face that problem. And I'm going to say, oh, I remember there was somebody on Joe's show who talked about this very thing. And I can go back and find that podcast. Conferences. So there's lots of virtual conferences. There's also, in-person conferences are starting back. So that's also a really great way to kind of get out of the office, get away from work. So you're not trying to multitask and, listen to a talk while you're working or in a meeting or something, right? You can give your devoted attention to this. And, attending conferences is not cheap. Sometimes there may be some free ones, but don't be afraid, again, to ask for your education budget, and you might be able to cover going to one. Also, you want to work with other automation engineers if possible. If you are new to automation engineer, you don't want to find a job where you're going to be the one to start the automation project initiative, right? That's going to be a very, very tough role. You're still learning. You're going to make a lot of mistakes, which, is expected. It's not a bad thing. But, you're better off, if you're completely new to this, to working with other automation engineers. My first few roles were with teams of automation engineers, and I can't tell you how that impacted me, how that affected my leveling up as an automation engineer. You learn so much from others. You're able to get on each other's code reviews and share best practices and kind of, do some nerd talking with other people who are interested in this niche. Now, those looking to break into the test automation field, some have difficulty doing so because of the lack of experience. One way to gain experience is not only to study, but to also practice on your own. But how do you demonstrate your newfound knowledge to potential employers? Other professionals, like such as front end developers or designers, they create portfolios to highlight their skills. And you can do the same thing as an automation engineer. So, one must have project to add to your portfolio is, of course, a UI web project. Now, be sure to go, beyond a basic login flow. Instead, you want to show some full examples that, require your code to interact with multiple pages. And this project should probably also demonstrate your ability to find element locators, to interact with various types of web elements, such as drop down menus, text fields, check boxes, buttons, links, alerts, file upload widgets, iframes. So all of these are common web elements that you need to know how to interact with, how to, read from, how to set data on, all of that, right? So definitely include this in your portfolio. This is excellent practice. And also be sure you're writing clean test code. So there's courses and books on that as well, on how do you make your code clean. So definitely look that up. And you want to utilize some design patterns that are specific to test automation, such as the page object model or the screenplay pattern. So there's two more things you can research. Also, a mobile test automation project would be something good to practice with. So the demand for mobile test automation engineers has increased over the years as, the popularity of mobile apps, has soared, right? Having experience here can certainly work in your favor. So your portfolio should demonstrate automated testing against both iOS and Android apps, and using Appium to create one project that works for both iOS and Android. That's a great idea, right? Also using the native tools such as Apple's XUI test or Google's Espresso. These are good as well. But if you go this route, I recommend doing at least two projects, one of each, since each one supports only one mobile operating system. With Appium, you'll get both. So you probably want to start there. No matter which of these frameworks you use, you'll want to demonstrate the same element interactions as you did in your web automation project, but also, mobile specific gestures such as swiping and pinching. After making your web and mobile projects, fork them and then add visual testing capabilities to them. And you'll quickly see just how much your tests are missing because they weren't enabled to verify the appearance of the application. So, visual testing is a skill that I'm seeing listed on a number of job postings, and having this skill will really help you shine against the competition. You'll also want to add an API testing project to your portfolio. With the rise of, things like microservices, IoT applications, public facing APIs, the demand for automation engineers who know how to test APIs has become substantial. Within this particular project, be sure to demonstrate like a variety of API methods with get and post as a minimum, and use APIs that, require parameters or request bodies. Also do things like return complex responses, with multiple objects in arrays. Okay. And for bonus points, use advanced verification techniques such as deserialization or even approval testing, which is a nice technique. Also, you want to demonstrate how to mock API responses. That's a really nice bonus to your portfolio. So, we talked about how some teams are practicing behavior driven development and automated tests based on the specifications produced. You'll want to demonstrate your experience with this and how you can jump in and hit the ground running. For this particular portfolio project, be sure not to only show the mapping between, the feature files and the step definitions, but also demonstrate how to share state between steps via dependency injection, for example. Also, be extremely careful when writing your feature files for BDD. Long, verbose feature files, they're just going to hurt your portfolio more than they'll help. Make this effort to write good, concise gherkin, which is the language you're using there. Now, you also want to demonstrate data driven testing. So, your practice projects may use only a small amount of test data. So, that's easy to store that data inside of the source code. However, when you're working on like a real product development team, you'll have hundreds, maybe even thousands of automated tests. And to keep up with all of this data, many teams adopt a data driven testing approach. So I recommend adding this to at least one of your projects to demonstrate your ability to programmatically read data from an external source, such as a spreadsheet file. And speaking of being able to access data from external sources, it's also a good idea to add a project that interacts with a database. Okay. So I recommend writing queries within your code to both read and write from a database and use this within the context of a test. So that's what I was getting at when I said you need that SQL skill. For example, you can read from the database to, gather the expected results of a search query, or you can write to a database to place your application, in a prerequisite state before proceeding to the test. Accessibility testing would also help you stand out from the crowd. Automating this type of testing has always been needed, but recently has become extremely important for companies. There have been legal battles where companies have been sued because their websites were not accessible to those with disabilities. So, demonstrating that you're able to do test automation for accessibility, this is going to give you a great advantage when applying for jobs. And you can use the same sites or apps that you use for your web and your mobile projects to demonstrate the accessibility testing. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel there. Other non functional areas, such as performance testing, security testing, these are also nice additions to your portfolio. Not necessarily required, but these are niche skills that many automation engineers they simply don't have. So adding these to your portfolio is definitely going to help you be perceived as a unicorn who really stands out from the crowd. Now, as you're building your portfolio, before you start, go ahead and create like a GitHub account and be sure to add these things to your project, your repo, and add them on your resume. It might not be a job that you're being paid to do, but you're definitely able to demonstrate your skills with this. So I wouldn't be shy to put this on the resume. Okay, so I know that was a lot, but I don't want you to be afraid. You can take this step by step. Remember, while I've given you quite an extensive overview, it's perfectly okay to focus on a single lane, master that, and then continuously learn more after you've already become an automation engineer. You can do it. I believe in you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Angie. That was really great and a lot of great information. I know, a lot of people are gonna probably want to go back and watch through that and just to glean all of the different tips that you shared. One question I had is at the beginning you mentioned, a situation where someone may be pushed into test automation out of necessity by a leader, and I imagine that there can be, some level of imposter syndrome or overwhelm that happens if they feel like they have these, skills as a developer, but they may not have that testing mindset, like you
Mhm.
said at the beginning. What advice would you have for somebody specifically in that situation to avoid getting discouraged?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I found is community helps a lot. And there's a very active community in the test automation space or testing in general. And you can find these folks on, that site I told you, Ministry of Testing, or on Twitter or on LinkedIn, kind of just look for people who just type in test automation. You'll see people who are talking about it. You'll find thought leaders as well as just kind of everyday folks who are trying to get through it themselves. And you'll be surprised there are quite a few people who are in that situation where, they didn't necessarily choose this career path, but there was a business need for it, and so it's a skill they need to learn. And there'll be some of them who are, like you said, developers who they haven't learned testing and in their traditional training. There'll be testers who didn't learn coding in their training, right? And so, you talk to these people, you kind of see that, hey, there's a lot of people who are kind of struggling with the same things that I am.
Yeah.
And, there's all kinds of Slack channels for these communities. And I'm in those Slack channels, and every day people come in and say, hey, I have this problem, whether it be technical, whether it be process driven, whether it be, hey, my manager doesn't want to give me money for a course. Any tips on how I can pitch it to them? Things like that. So definitely find community and get to know others.
Yeah, that's awesome. It definitely sounds like a great discipline and field for the learning in public and the building in public community.
Definitely.
Awesome. And one final question I had, you mentioned that you'd been in this field for 20 years. How did you get started in test automation? And what do you wish that you had known, especially at the beginning of your career and when you got started in it?
Yeah. So test automation was actually my first job. When I graduated from school, I was hired by IBM for a development role. And I was hired like in the spring, but you don't graduate until, almost summertime. And then my first day was the summer. Well, anybody who knows anything about IBM knows that they do a lot of kind of reorg and shuffling around. So by the time I started, my job wasn't there anymore. But fortunately, they found another place for me. I wanted to use my new shiny, programming skills that I just paid a ton of money to obtain.
Uh-huh.
And so they told me, hey, there's this test automation role. And I said, well, I don't know what that is, but do I get the code? And they said, yes. And fortunately, there were other test automation engineers that I got to work with who taught me a lot about testing and how to use my coding skills for that purpose. Since then, I've done a couple of stints in straight up feature development, and I really like the automation role a lot better. I feel like I get, a bigger sense of the project, a larger view of it. I get to think about my customers a lot more. When I work on just, a simple feature as a developer, I feel, almost isolated, like I'm working on that in kind of like a cubby. Whereas with the automation, it was, just a larger reach, I felt. One thing that I wish that I knew, there was there was and probably still is a little bit of a stigma associated to testing in relation to development. So some of the older shops, it's getting much better now, but some of the older shops would maybe consider, oh, testing, I don't want to do testing, or, think that it was beneath development. But um this is something that made me feel kind of bad in the beginning of my career and almost like an imposter. But what I've learned is sometimes people shun things that they don't know how to do, right? They were really the ones with imposter syndrome. And like I said, a lot of developers, they didn't learn this in their curriculum. They don't know how to do it. And so, they kind of downplay it as if it's not that important. But what I've learned now is they just don't know, and they want to know secretly. And so now I'm brought into, all types of companies, big and small, and the big top 10 tech companies to teach their developers how to write tests.
Yeah. That's awesome. Actually, what one final question? When you were talking about personas and coming to these essentially agreed upon scenarios for the tests that you're going to run, I'm curious what it's like when you're doing that for a tool or for a company that has a very technical audience versus, for an app that the people using it may be completely non-technical, like something in healthcare, for example, or something like that, where you have to really step outside of your own
Mm.
skill set and your own experience to think about how quote unquote everyday people would use it. Do you have any advice or any experience for developing personas and developing tests when you have that scenario?
Yeah. So I've worked on some projects that were totally out of my wheelhouse, some legal software. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know anything about
Yeah.
these terms. All kinds of stuff, healthcare stuff, system management stuff, all of this that I have no clue what it is. And what helped me is going and peeking over at some of the tickets that are coming in to like the help desk, for example. And then you start to see problems and issues people have. You start to see requests, and then you can kind of see, like, oh, that's how they're using the project, or that's how they want to use it, or these are the goals, right?
Mhm.
Also, I like to attend like some of the meetings that happen early in the development cycle. So, like the requirements gathering and the design phases and stuff like that. A lot of that's integrated these days, and it's kind of like ongoing cycle. But if you can get involved early, you start to learn a lot more, like, and ask questions. So, sometimes we just get a feature and we just develop it and we test it or whatever, but we don't really know who's going to use this or why. So ask those questions, like, who's requesting this, or why are we building this? And that gives you a lot of insight into how people are going to use the product. And there's this technique that's called soap opera driven testing. And it's really fun exercise that I like to use if I need to test, but it's basically where you kind of come up with these characters in your head, right? And you might say, okay, I'm gonna draw Susie. Susie is a nurse. Susie's goal when she comes on this app is to do X, Y, and Z. I have Bob over here. Bob got in a car accident last week, and so he's temporarily disabled. Is he still able to use the application? I have such and such. Let's call her Sally. Sally, she's always on the go, so she needs to use the application from her mobile device, not a laptop. So then you do all of Sally's scenarios on your mobile device, right? So this kind of gives you like all of these personas and their context and situation, so that you can come up with more thoughtful tests.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Angie, thank you again for taking the time. I want to remind everyone that this webinar will be available on demand. We'll email it to you at the email that you registered with. You can also go watch it immediately on YouTube if you don't want to wait for that email. But Angie, before we sign off, is there any final takeaway or last thought for the people watching?
Yeah, I just want to re-emphasize that I know that there is a lot to learn. Again, you do not have to learn it all at once. Take it step by step. Hopefully, I've broken this down into like 3 steps, and I know each each of the steps was, full of information. But take it step by step. You can do it. You don't have to learn everything before you start working in this space. Get enough to get started, and then just continuously learn.
Awesome. Great advice. You can do it.